Behold the 1965 Fender twin reverb amplifier, and it has been resurrected. We've gone through it and done some refurbishing to hopefully make it last another 59 years. And it's a beautiful old amp and it sounds amazing. Check that out. Let's get a little bit of a side profile here. Oh yeah, absolutely gorgeous amplifier. Going back to the owner is all the original parts that were removed. We'll save those for prosperity. All vacuum sealed so they won't get separated. And then we have a little envelope that'll stay with the amp. And we've got the voltage test chart in there that shows all the voltage readings I took and a complete list of repairs and things that were done to this amplifier. So stay tuned. We'll take a look at some of the work we did and a few little sound samples. Enjoy. Thanks for tuning in. And here we can see some of the heat damage that the amplifier suffered from, as evidenced by the discoloration on the chassis, but thankfully we were able to get it cleaned up. You notice the little brown spot right in the middle, and that's where the wire was grounding to the chassis from underneath. We got that fixed, but pretty scary to think that this thing was lit up with that much voltage. Another shot of the heat here you can see. Wow, this thing was cooked. But check this out. We got it pretty clean, and there you go. So it's good to go. Looking a lot better, and that should help it future troubleshooting if they see any discoloration there. And this is one of the potentiometers, one of the volume potentiometers that we disassembled and cleaned. Turned out real good. They responded well to cleaning. Looking good there, and it wasn't too bad. They went back together nicely. And here's the old filter capacitors that we took out. It's all new now. On this side of the amp, we did swap out everything underneath what we call the doghouse, which includes the new 220K resistors under there that you can barely see the one. There's another one here. And new resistors here and new capacitors there. This board was fully disassembled, cleaned underneath, etc., put back together with a lot of attention to detail. We did clean up around the tube sockets, but you can still see the one, barely see the one little spot, welding spot where that wire was grounded underneath. But we got it pretty clean. I'm surprised at how clean we were able to get this side of the chassis. All right, let's take a look under the hood. We're going to start with the front panel. First thing that we're going to talk about is the mid pots, or the middle pots here, potentiometers, pots for short. Someone had installed 250K pots in place of the factory 10K. So we opted to go back with the 10K per the schematic, and everything's working great. Also, I was disappointed, but I had to replace the input jack at number 1 on the normal channel, and the contacts were not making good contact. No matter how I tried to clean it and straighten it out and make it work, it would not work. So I had to replace that. The front panel itself, the knobs were removed one at a time and cleaned and put back in their original positions. While I had them off, I verified the tightness of the nut that holds the potentiometer on there. Same thing with the nuts that hold the input jacks on. Those were verified for tightness, and the screws on the right switches. Think of the same exact thing on the rear panel. Everything was snugged up and taken care of. Also, both panels, front and rear, were cleaned and waxed with carnauba wax to make sure that the paint will be protected for a long time to come. And that's pretty much it on the front panel. The rest of the pots are all original, and we did clean them, and they responded very well to cleaning, and they work very, very good now, and I'm very pleased with that. So we only had to replace the 2. Don't know where the originals went. That was long before I ever touched the amp. So now let's move on to the inside of this incredible amplifier. In the back here, the incoming power, we rerouted it to bypass the 2-prong ungrounded electrical outlet and also the ground switch. We deemed that they were no longer necessary, but obviously we kept them in place so there wouldn't be any ugly gaping holes in the back that would allow small children and curious adults to stick their fingers in there and get electrocuted. Of particular note back here, the wire that connects pin 1 on valve 7 and 8, this yellow wire in the back here, this was shorting to the chassis, causing a bad problem. Just beneath the fuse holder here, you can see there's a black spot on the chassis where it had been burning and arcing for God knows how long. We've gotten that taken care of. As far as the tube sockets themselves, you can see they're brand new. I tried everything I know and everything I could find to try to tighten those sockets up to hold the tubes a little tighter, but I couldn't. They were wobbly like crazy, so I figured it was safe to go ahead and put in new tube sockets. Also, new screen and grid resistors on each one. And we stood those resistors off just a little bit to get a little more airflow around them so they're not so susceptible to the heat. You may notice some little dots of green paint on here. Well, that's a common practice back in the day to put a little drop of paint on a screw to keep it from coming loose, or an extra level of protection to hopefully prevent it from coming loose. And since these screws right here for the tube sockets, I broke the seal, in other words, they hadn't been turned since 1965, I said, well, let's put a little dab on there. It won't hurt. It can be easily removed for those that are offended in the future by the sight of that. If you look in here, we've got a new capacitor in the bias circuit and also a new resistor here because it tested out a tolerance. Again, continuing along the back of the amp, everything that bolts to the back of the amp was verified for tightness as well as the front of the amp. And we also looked at all the electrical connections really good and tugged on each wire gently where they attach with a pair of needle nose pliers to make sure they weren't loose. Good thing we did that because over here on valve 1, the red wire, your signal coming into the tube, that one just popped right off the minute I touched it. So it was obviously fragile and getting ready to come off. We also inspected each solder joint throughout the entire amp with a magnifying glass and a strong flashlight to make sure they looked good. There was nothing crazy going on. And then also we made up a voltage chart where we tested every pin that has a wire connected to it on every tube socket and other key points within the amplifier. Voltages were written down and recorded on a chart, printed, and those are going to be with the amplifier. In case anybody besides me works on it sometime in the future, they'll have the voltage chart from March 2024 to go by. Let's move on now to the main board and talk about this beautiful thing here. First off, the blue molded capacitors that you see here, all of those were lifted and tested with a capacitance meter, and they were all perfect, like dead on. And so we soldered them back down, they're good to go. But if you will notice, almost every other capacitor on the board has been replaced because they tested outside of tolerance, okay? So, and it sounds so much better when you've got the proper tolerance in there. The tremolo circuit here, if you'll notice, the first capacitor in line here is a little different color. That's because we swapped out the 0.01 with a 0.02, and what that does is effectively slow down the starting speed of the tremolo. And let me tell you something, it is sexy. It sounds so good. Several resistors on the board were swapped out because they no longer tested within tolerance. As you can see, almost exclusively, I kept them all the same type of resistor to maintain the original look, with the exception of these big ugly blue ones right here. In this particular part of the circuit, I wanted these two to be perfectly matched, and these were perfectly matched 220K ohms, so I said I'm just going to use them. They can easily be swapped out. But of the original looking ones here, these old style resistors, I have a whole bunch of 220s, but I couldn't find any that were exactly spot on, and I just wanted to be particular about those two. Let's see here. Also, the electrolytic capacitors have been swapped out for these little guys here that are in the Y shape. There's 6 here and 1 here. Again, they were leaking electrolyte and bulging and not looking too good. I think we've covered everything else. The bias is set just right for these tubes and what the owner wants to play at, what type of sound he's looking for. Nothing too crazy, pretty much middle of the road bias setting. And I think that is it. Also, worth mentioning, I did unscrew the board and I very, very gently lifted it up, and using a flashlight and an inspection mirror, I was able to look underneath to make sure all the wires are routed correctly, connected correctly, and that there's no extraneous wires or BS underneath that would come back and haunt us and surprise us someday. We also used our magnifying glass and a powerful light to look at every single solder joint here to make sure everything is perfect as can be. And as evident by testing it and playing it, I think we got it right. It turned out good. So this beautiful old Blackface Fender Twin Reverb from the same year I was born, it's going to live to see another day and hopefully last another 59 years.